Yes, all good.
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to start the presentation, and today we'll be talking about how to link biodiversity impacts to a global supply chain. We will be using the case of soy production in Brazil, specifically in the Cerrado biome. And this is a collaborative research project that took place a few years ago under the Luke Hoffman Institute Fellowship. So quickly, the structure of the session today, we had already the welcome and the updates. Our talk should last around 40 minutes, and we will have 5 minutes for questions. And then we hope to have a rich discussion on how to promote knowledge co-production in the Trade Hub, which is a topic that we're going to also mention within the talk, and then a final wrap up. So my first slide shows a typology of how drivers of biodiversity loss can operate. And if we focus on the top box, we see some examples of drivers of habitat loss, such as population growth, governance, consumption patterns, and poverty. And these drivers can variously influence the sectors within which human activities take place, such as urbanization, mining, plantation, agriculture, and tourism. And these sectors can also affect the state of biodiversity through different mechanisms, and here I show two examples of habitat loss and habitat degradation. And within this research, we argue that traditionally efforts to understand biodiversity loss have focused mainly on the sectors and the mechanism that affect the state of biodiversity. However, in order to really address the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss, we should be able to assess the full pathway through which drivers of biodiversity loss operate. And here in bold, the different boxes, we see, as we all know, that agricultural consumption patterns is a very important pathway, or in other words, the consumption patterns of agricultural commodities is a very important pathway that affects, that has historically affected biodiversity loss. So within agricultural consumption production system, a very important component is supply chains. Supply chains is a system of organization, people, information, resources that are involved in the supplying of products, of services to consumers. And because the increasing globalization of our economic system, supply chains have become very broad, very big, encompassing different areas around the world where the place of production of one commodity can be very far from the place where that commodity is consumed. And that has made supply chains very complex and very opaque, which is illustrated here in this flow diagram, which is a screenshot of the Trace platform, which John's going to tell you more about it later on. But we can see at the left of the slide, first of all, that the production patterns of a specific commodity, here in case is soy, can be very heterogeneous across the space with different shade of blue. And this production then flows across a large number of actors and places, starting from with municipalities and exporter groups and importer, and then reaching the consumption country that can be quite far away. So in this case, we have a driver of biodiversity loss that is global, that is operated through supply chains that are complex and are opaque, and therefore the solutions to address this issue are difficult to devise. And while in our research project, and in this presentation we might not come up with a specific solution, what we wanted to test is to what extent developing a framework that could answer what is being impacted, where, and who is driving these impacts can be a good source of information to support existing supply chain initiatives that promote better sustainability within supply chain systems. So in order to develop this information, this practical information, we realized within the research project that we required a multidisciplinary framework. And part of this realization was thanks to the strong engagement that we had with a group of stakeholders, which I'm gonna now talk later about that. But in this engagement, we realized that there were 3 pieces of information that could really provide some key insights on how to address the sustainability of a supply chain network. So the first one at the left of the slide is a practical environmental footprint. With practical, is a footprint that can be applied easily, that can be easily communicated, that can use data that are accessible, and that can be applied anywhere. And of course, that tell us what is being affected and where. And that another line of information will be that a approach that tell us how to make supply chains more transparent. It means like, who are the actors or the entities that are driving and governing the estimated impacts by the footprint. And then another component is to know to what extent actors along the supply chain are aligned. And here aligned, I mean to understand what are the different challenges and opportunities and motivations behind these different key actors in order to change their practices, in order to engage with sustainable initiatives. And this component is in red because that was led by another colleague of us, and we will not be presenting that, but we're going to be presenting the other 2 components. So as I mentioned early on, we had this project, we make sure that we had a strong engagement process with stakeholders involved in a supply chain initiative. In this case was WWF Brazil and the Nature Conservancy, that at that time they were leading a big project that trying to organize the actors and promote better standards within the soy and beef industry in Brazil. And it was a very interesting process. And when I say interesting, that for us researchers to really invest time to engage with the stakeholders, to understand their vision and the different sources of information from the system. And here's when we put effort in co-producing the information that would help us to design this multidisciplinary framework and our methodologies. And in this green box, I've listed 5 key needs or requests that we obtain from the stakeholders, which I'm going to go through them again, but quickly to mention that, for instance, they said that they wanted a biodiversity footprint that was able to highlight the impact on specific species, on flagship species, so they could use that information to support their strategies and their campaigns and their engagement with the industry. As I said, a practical biodiversity impact metric or flexible metric, also a metric that was able to assess any type of habitat conversion and not only deforestation, and therefore could also be implemented in other biomes than the Amazon, because as you might know, the Amazon has attracted a lot of attention in Brazil, and sometimes other biomes have been a bit overlooked. And also some methods or approaches that could clarify the confusion across supply chain actors. And when I mean confusion here is this complexity, this opacity, right? That we have a lot of actors, there is no clarity who is very involved, and also what are the challenges that they face, the opportunities that they face, and their motivations. So we work with WWF Brazil in the Cerrado. The Cerrado is the second largest biome in the Brazil after the Amazon. Is characterized for having for being made up of grasslands, long extensions of grassland and shrubland. It has a very high proportion of endemic species, specifically plants. However, the Cerrado has been heavily converted. About half of its extension has been converted for grassland for livestock and soy production, here showed in the red. And indeed, Brazil is a very important global producer of soy. And as this diagram shows, about 0.5% of the soy produced in Brazil takes place within the Cerrado only. And this has been a response of the increasing global demand of soy to feed pork, poultry, and beef sometimes. So how we develop and we design this framework, these methodologies, and I would now be telling you about the biodiversity footprint, which is some of the work that I led within this collaborative project. So, as I mentioned before, we engage with these stakeholders to understand what were their needs to apply this information that we were developing, this methodology we were developing. And here I list 3 key characteristics that they mentioned that the metric should have. As I said, it should be species specific. So it's a metric that could tell us what's going on and what's the impact at species level. Again, in order to capture some cases on examples for flagship species, some species that are important and that can drag attention. Also a metric that can be linked to a specific activity. And in this case, when I say specific activity, I mean a specific crop system. In this case is soy. In order so we could track, right, all the consumption patterns associated to this system, which is soy. And very important was the scalability of the metric. So we could express the metric at different administrative scales, let's say municipalities or state, which often are the scales, the subnational administrative scales at which data for trade models are available. So this was more a sort of a technical requirement. And an approach that would allow us to represent, to capture these 3 characteristics was the habitat suitability models. The habitat suitability models, in very general terms, is models that allow us to map the habitat in which an individual species is likely present, or the habitat that individual species prefer. And by evaluating the conversion of this habitat due to a specific activity, in this case soy, we can then assess the relative impact that this activity has in the decline of this habitat associated to this specific species. So as this diagram shows, if we start at the left, we can see that the rhino and the little rats are both present in natural habitat, while the rat is only present in arable land. And then when the natural land is converted at the far right, we see that the rhino is no longer present in certain areas. So there are many ways different ways to map suitable habitat models. And in our case, we wanted a metric that could be practical, that can use accessible data. And therefore, we went with an approach called the area of habitat model, also known as the extent of suitable habitat, which simply is finding this habitat that a species prefer by clipping the geographic range of an individual species against environmental variables that are associated to the habitat preference of a specific species. So in this case, land cover can tell us about the habitat preference through an harmonization process, suitable elevation, but also you could add any other variable that is available if the information is available for the species. And then by clipping all this information, you come up with a smaller extent that tell us where likely a species take place. And then by assessing this extent against habitat loss analysis or due to a crop expansion, for the case of soy, we can then analyze the extent that soy affects the habitat loss of that specific species. So another important characteristic that our metric should have, that we identified, was that this metric should be able to capture the cumulative effects of historical habitat loss on biodiversity. And what I mean with this, I want to illustrate it quickly with an example that is not in the slides, but maybe if you listen to me, I should be able to explain it. If we have two species, species A and species B, and both species lose exactly the same extent of habitat within a time frame. However, species A had lost by that time already 90% of its original range of habitat, while species B had lost only 10% of its original range. Likely, the effect of that same extent of habitat loss won't be the same in the likelihood of persistence of those two local populations. And that fact for us was very important to capture, mainly for a practical reason, which was that most of the habitat conversion in the Cerrado had already happened before the year 2000, which was the first year, the starting point of assessment of our research. And the cumulative effect of historical habitat loss was captured by assuming a nonlinear relationship between the proportion of area of habitat loss and the response impact metric that we name persistence score, and is represented in this diagram where we have proportion of extent of suitable habitat in the x-axis, and we have the response impact score in the y-axis. And quickly, if we focus on the orange band in the x-axis, we can see that if a species loses a extent of area loss after not having lost much of its original extent, the effect in changing the persistence score is rather small in the letter C, in the y-axis. However, if the species then loses the same extent of area, but after losing much more of a larger extent of its original habitat, then the delta on its persistence score can be much larger. And that's how we capture that cumulative effects on biodiversity. So what could finally be illustrated or represented through this metric? Well, in the left side of the slide, we could see that we could actually capture the impacts of habitat conversion at a species level, which we illustrated through the big five of the Cerrado, which are 5 mammals that live in the Cerrado, or whose global ranges intersect with the Cerrado, which in this case are the maned wolf, giant armadillo, giant anteater, the jaguar, and the South American tapir. And we could see here in the, well, we have in the x-axis the time, the different years that we assess, and the persistence score in the y-axis. And we see that each have different sort of patterns of decline of the persistence score. An interesting fact to capture here is that the maned wolf, as you can see, which is at the top, doesn't show a very strong decline. And the reason is because the maned wolf can live in arable lands. So the conversion of its original habitat is not reflected on the decline of its habitat very sharply. This same information can be also grouped across different taxonomic groups, which here we have the at the right of the slide, we have the we have amphibians, we have birds, mammals, and plants. And we separated the decline of the persistence score through the level of endemisms, being the darker line is the groups of species that are more endemic to the Cerrado. And finally, we also could illustrate how the metric can be adapted at different scales. That, as you remember, was one of the needs, the requests from the stakeholder groups. And if we see at the left of the slide, we can see the biodiversity impacts across different states. And we can see that of course, it looks that the impact is rather homogeneous within each state. However, if we move to the municipality level, we see that the distribution of this impact is not homogeneous at all. Indeed, there are some municipalities that become very important hotspots of impact. Indeed, if we see the case of Tocantins, which is the green state with a TO at the top, that at the state level shows that it doesn't have a very high impact relative to other states. Actually, there is one municipality within Tocantins that is covered by a little star there that actually concentrates most of the impact and is comparable with other municipalities too. And again, this then we can move to the cell level where the heterogeneity of the impact distribute much more in detail. So how can we then connect these, how can we connect these different patterns of impact to trade models, to consumption models? And now is what John is going to tell you about it. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so he can share his screen. Yes? Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, can you guys see the screen? Yeah, as if by magic it's the same one, hopefully. Yeah. Okay, so now moving on to the second section, which is really about the supply chains and how we join those to the biodiversity impact. So we've got the biodiversity metric, And then the next step is to think about how we model the movement of a physical commodity and how that enters international supply chains. So for now, and I'll go into a bit more depth, you can think about this as two components. So the first is the physical production and trade of a commodity, in this case soy, and we have implemented this using the trace model, but it could be other material flow accounts. And then the second step is to link that to a multi-regional input-output model. And again, in this case, it's GTAP, but it could be any MRIO. And these two bits you might hear us referring to, you will hear us referring to as Iota. So Iota is something that we developed, I say we, was developed at York with Simon and Chris. Chris West is on the call. And at the moment, it's implemented using trace and GTAP, but the framework could be extended to incorporate other material flow accounts and other MRIOs. So I'm starting here because this is for two reasons. First is it shows the importance of the agricultural sector and particularly soybeans for Brazil. And this is really the essence of the Trade Hub. Actually, this is a crucially important economic sector for the country. Agriculture in general has driven a lot of development, and that's and yet we're also we know that it's driven a lot of negative change as well in some instances, particularly for biodiversity. And so that's the starting point for Trade Hub. But this is also the starting point for our modelling work within the TRACE project, which is the physical production and subnational trade of the commodity. So our starting point is the export records, and this is a good place to start. So I would just, first of all, I'd really like to encourage you to have an explore of the TRACE website. So if you go to trace.earth, you can play around and first of all have a look at the data tools where you can explore the data. So that you can explore the soy supply chain, where it's coming from, where it's going to, and who's involved in that supply chain. You can also go into the insights, which offer lots of curated information on various commodities and their contexts. And then you can also download and explore the data in different ways for yourself. And then I would also encourage you to get in touch with any of us in the York team about the trace model work that we do, but also about the MRO stuff that we do. And so I say that we start with the export data. So you can buy data essentially, which is a compilation of things like, sometimes it's just customs data, but sometimes it's also supplemented with information from shipping manifests, from bills of lading. And what this gives us is everything within that red box. So here you can see it will give you the people that are, or the company that's exporting it, the company that's importing it. It will also give you the port that it's going from and to, and the country that it's imported to in the first instance. So the starting point then for the subnational modeling is that we have the companies that are exporting the commodity. We also need some subnational production data, and we also need some information on the facilities. We need a way to distribute the sourcing through the country. So what we do is we get information from governments, from self-declarations, which is the company that provide information on where their facilities are, and other research into logistical hubs. And as an example, this is a map of our soy facilities in Brazil. And you can see there's that there's a lot of them, and B, that there are different types. We've got crushing facilities, refining facilities, and storage facilities. And importantly, we also have ownership records, so we know who owns the company. And that allows us to start to make the links between the companies that are exporting and then where they might be sourcing from, or where they might be processing the commodity they're exporting. And then from there, we can then link through to the production areas of the soy fields. Which is what we've got there. So this shows the municipalities that are producing soy in a particular year. I think it was 2018. So once we've distributed that, we've moved from the national production and export, and we distributed that production, or that export through to the areas where we're expecting it to be produced. We can then we do that at a municipal level, so that's this map on the right, and then that allows us now to link through to the map that Paz described earlier, where she's aggregated up from the pixel level to the municipality level. And then what we have then is a risk that we allocate proportionately to the supply chains that are sourcing from these regions, according to the biodiversity risk, or the biodiversity that has been lost in those regions to soy. So the next step of the trade model is the MRIO step. So input and output tables detail sales and purchases in financial terms between sectors within an economy, and they also provide sectoral level value for imports and exports and sales to consumers. So the sales to the consumers is our final demand. Now that's an input output table. In order to make it a multi-regional input output table, we aggregate lots of usually country specific individual IO tables, and our intermediate demand is then expanded to include imports and exports as inter-sectoral expenditure between countries. And then the final demand is now detailing the purchases from other economies as well as from your own domestic sector. And that's in essence what an MRIO is, and Work Package 2 will be providing more training on both trace and MRIOs. But then what we do is we link the material flow account, so that's trace. So where that reaches the country of first import, we then allow the MRIO, we then essentially stitch those two sets of data together, and we allow the MRIO to take over in order to be able to follow not just to the country of first import, but ultimately who is driving the impacts. And we've got this environmental extension, which in this case is biodiversity loss, but it could be anything. It could be greenhouse gas emissions. So we have our environmental extension, and we are hybridizing this MRIO in the blue with our physical production and trade model to get an environmentally extended and hybridized multi-regional input-output model. An EH-MRIO, I think we'll call it. Why do we do this? So the first thing is that it allows us to answer some quite interesting questions, we think, and it gives us a really good picture of the system. So it tells us which sectors and countries are driving the impacts. It tells us what the relative roles are of different traders within that system. We can, with the environmental extension, we can find out what are the impacts on high profile species, and we can do that for different traders, we can do it for different countries. And we can also start to think about how do the commitments made by governments or private companies overlap. So what do we learn? We learned these four things actually. So first of all, whose consumption drives the impacts? So we can look at both the soy consumption. So this is soy consumed by our top 10 countries, and you can see that maybe as you would expect, Brazil consumes a lot of its own soy. You might expect that it would trade quite locally, but actually, of course, countries around it also produce their own soy. So you don't see Argentina and Paraguay so high in this list. And your biggest consumer is China, but the EU also features heavily if you aggregate to that level. What's more interesting probably is looking at the biodiversity impact. So you can see that actually Brazil consumes a lot of its own soy, and it also has it has a relatively high impact. So it's consuming somewhere between 25 and 30% of the soy, but it's having something like 45% of the impact on biodiversity. China, on the other hand, although it's consuming over 30% of the soy, is having closer to 20% of the impact. And this is quite interesting for thinking about what is our relative impact per ton of soy consumed, and I guess starting to think about strategies for so I guess there are two options. One is to try and reduce your consumption, and the other is to try and minimize the impact of your consumption, and hopefully both in tandem. The second thing that we looked at is the loss of flagship species. So this is just a couple. This is the maned wolf, which is something called like a fox on stilts, and the anteater, the giant anteater, which is commonly or sometimes said to look a bit like a toilet brush with a handle, and the brush being the tail. So you can see here that you can see these are states within Brazil, and you can see where the impact on the maned wolf is going to, or where it's coming from. So this is Brazilian consumption is having the major impact in Goiás on the maned wolf, and in general Brazilian consumption is having a bigger effect than anywhere else. You see the rest of South America has a relatively small impact, and you see that again similarly for the giant anteater. And we can also start to look at ask questions about scale and spatial resolution, which Chris mentioned in his comment earlier. But this is maybe slightly complicated map, but there are two things I guess to focus on. So one is on the colours. So the red areas and the orangey colours show the dominance of the top trader. So where it's red, that is the trader trading the most out of that municipality is trading more than 95% of the soy. So it shows how one trader in an area is, I guess it allows you to think about targeting your interventions. And then the other thing is just to look at the symbols, so you can see that the companies tend to be clustered in areas. So Bunge, for instance, clustered towards the east. And so we also know that impacts on biodiversity are quite concentrated. So 33% of soy impacts on endemic species were in Goiás, which occupies only 16% of the area. And in Goiás there were 41 traders, this was in 2011, trading out of the state. And yet we also were able to see that at the municipality level, the largest trader, the most dominant traders are exporting more like 95+% of the soy out of there. So it really allows us to think about how to prioritize interventions and target those places and those stakeholders with the greatest influence. And then the final question or result is just thinking about the overlap between commitments of actors within the supply chain. So the Amsterdam Declaration is 7 and hopefully increasing soon EU countries that pledge to support elimination of deforestation from supply chains. But if we actually look, we can look at those countries and their imports. So we can look at the Netherlands, for instance, which imports, so this is just direct imports. The Netherlands imports a lot of the EU's soy into its ports. And we can see that actually a good proportion, so in green is companies with zero deforestation commitments. That's not to say they've met them by any means, or they definitely haven't. But we can look at those that don't have any or didn't have any zero deforestation commitments, and start to think about where are the leverage points? Is it from the companies to the country, or the country to the companies? And starting to think about, for instance, Germany has the vast majority of its imported soy coming from companies that have made similar commitments to it, that it's made at the national level. And yeah, that's the end of the talk, and then we will move shortly on to talking about co-production. But I think at this point there's just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so, just to any clarification questions or anyone to ask anything. And Paz is online as well.
Yeah, if maybe anyone would like open the mic and just ask, maybe it might be more straightforward.
Are there any questions? I think Chris has been very busy in the chat box as well, answering the questions as they came up. So there were some questions about the scale, what you meant, was it the pixels or the scale at municipality level? And I think Chris answered that, together with how you've incorporated consumption into the models as well, where the final consumption of meat is reflected there. And again, Chris has answered some of that as well.